In the dimly lit study of his villa outside Florence, Niccolò Machiavelli sat hunched over his desk, the flickering candlelight casting dancing shadows across the manuscript that would change how men understood power forever. The year was 1513, and the former diplomat had fallen from grace, exiled from the political arena he once dominated. Yet in this moment of personal defeat, he was crafting insights that would echo through centuries, revealing truths about human nature that most dare not acknowledge. The quill scratched against parchment as he penned words that would scandalize the Christian world. It is better to be feared than loved, if you cannot be both. But this was merely the surface of a deeper philosophy, one that recognized a fundamental truth about the nature of respect, power, and human interaction. Machiavelli understood what countless men throughout history have learned too late, that niceness without strength is not virtue, it is weakness disguised as moral superiority. The morning sun had barely crested the Tuscan hills when Lorenzo de' Medici's messenger arrived at the villa, bearing news that would validate everything Machiavelli had been writing. The young duke, following the very principles Machiavelli advocated, had successfully consolidated power in Florence through a careful balance of calculated ruthlessness and strategic benevolence. He had shed his earlier tendency toward people-pleasing and had emerged as a leader who commanded genuine respect rather than mere politeness born of pity. This transformation from weakness to strength, from the nice guy who finishes last to the respected leader who shapes his own destiny, forms the cornerstone of Machiavellian philosophy. It is not about becoming a tyrant or abandoning all moral considerations. Rather, it is about recognizing that true strength comes from within, and that a man who has conquered his own weaknesses, his need for constant approval, his fear of confrontation, his tendency to prioritize others' comfort over his own principles, becomes virtually invincible in the face of external challenges. The weak man lives in constant fear of disapproval. He adjusts his opinions to match those around him, compromises his values to avoid conflict, and sacrifices his own needs to maintain the illusion of harmony. He believes that by being agreeable, by always saying yes, by never rocking the boat, he will earn love and respect. But, Machiavelli observed, with the cold clarity of a political scientist studying human behavior, that this approach inevitably leads to contempt rather than admiration. Consider the case of Cesare Borgia, whom Machiavelli studied with fascination. Borgia understood that respect could not be earned through weakness or constant accommodation. When he conquered the Romagna region, he appointed Ramiro de Orco as his deputy, knowing that harsh measures were necessary to establish order. De Orco ruled with an iron fist, implementing severe punishments for crime and corruption. The people grew to hate de Orco, but order was established. Then, in a masterstroke that revealed his understanding of human psychology, Borgia had de Orco executed publicly, showing the people that he would not tolerate even his own appointees abusing their power. The result was both respect and admiration. The people saw Borgia as strong enough to make hard decisions, yet just enough to punish wrongdoing even among his allies. This example illustrates a crucial principle: the man who destroys his weak self understands that leadership sometimes requires making unpopular decisions. He does not seek to be liked by everyone because he recognizes that universal approval is both impossible and undesirable. Instead, he focuses on earning genuine respect through consistent strength of character, clear principles, and the courage to act according to his convictions even when it is difficult or unpopular. The weak self manifests in countless ways throughout a man's life. It appears in the workplace when he accepts credit for others' ideas rather than advocating for his own contributions. It shows itself in relationships when he agrees to arrangements that fundamentally compromise his values or well-being because he fears losing the other person's approval. It emerges in social situations when he laughs at jokes that offend him, supports causes he doesn't believe in, or remains silent when his principles are being mocked or attacked. Each of these compromises seems small in isolation, but collectively they form a pattern of weakness that others quickly learn to exploit. The man who cannot say no becomes the man who is always asked to do more while receiving less. The man who never stands up for himself becomes the man others feel comfortable disrespecting. The man who constantly seeks approval becomes the man whose opinion carries no weight because everyone knows it can be swayed by the slightest social pressure. Machiavelli's genius lay in his recognition that this cycle could be broken, but only through a fundamental transformation of the self. The process is not easy, nor is it pleasant. It requires a man to confront uncomfortable truths about his own behavior and motivations. It demands that he examine every instance where he has chosen the path of least resistance rather than the path of integrity. It necessitates that he develop the strength to disappoint others when their expectations conflict with his own values and goals. The transformation begins with radical self-honesty. A man must acknowledge where he has been weak, where he has compromised his principles for the sake of temporary peace or approval. He must recognize the patterns of behavior that have led others to take advantage of his good nature or dismiss his contributions. This is perhaps the most difficult part of the process because it requires admitting that much of what he has labeled as virtue, his agreeableness, his reluctance to cause offense, his willingness to put others first, has actually been a form of cowardice disguised as kindness. The second phase involves developing clear, non-negotiable principles. A strong man knows what he stands for and what he will not tolerate. He has boundaries that are not subject to negotiation based on who is asking or what convenience might be gained by crossing them. These principles become his armor against manipulation and his guide for making decisions that align with his authentic self rather than the expectations of others. But principles without the courage to enforce them remain merely philosophical exercises. The third and most crucial phase involves learning to act according to these principles even when doing so is uncomfortable, unpopular, or costly. This is where the rubber meets the road, where the theoretical becomes practical, and where the weak self is finally and definitively destroyed. Consider the modern workplace, where these principles play out daily in countless small interactions that ultimately determine a man's trajectory. The weak man arrives early, stays late, and volunteers for every additional project, believing that his willingness to sacrifice will be rewarded with recognition and advancement. Instead, he finds himself taken for granted, passed over for promotions that go to colleagues who make fewer contributions but advocate more effectively for themselves. The strong man, guided by Machiavellian wisdom, approaches the situation differently. He delivers excellent work but does not sacrifice his well-being or compromise his other commitments to compensate for poor planning or unrealistic expectations from others. When asked to take on additional responsibilities, he evaluates them based on their alignment with his goals and the value they provide to his career development. If the request does not serve these purposes, he politely but firmly declines, offering alternatives when appropriate but not apologizing for protecting his own interests. This approach initially creates discomfort for those accustomed to his previous accommodating behavior. They may express disappointment or attempt to guilt him into reverting to his old patterns. This is the crucial test, the moment when he must choose between the temporary discomfort of standing firm and the long-term consequences of returning to weakness. The man who chooses strength discovers that the initial resistance eventually gives way to respect. Colleagues begin to value his time more highly because they recognize it is not unlimited. Supervisors begin to see him as someone with clear priorities and strong judgment rather than simply a reliable workhorse. The same principles apply to personal relationships, perhaps even more critically. The nice guy who enters romantic relationships believing that constant accommodation and self-sacrifice will earn love and devotion typically finds himself in partnerships characterized by imbalance and eventual contempt. He becomes the man who always initiates contact, always makes plans according to his partner's preferences, always apologizes first after disagreements regardless of who was actually at fault. This pattern creates a dynamic where his needs and desires become secondary, not because his partner is necessarily selfish or manipulative, but because he has trained them to expect that his preferences will always yield to theirs. Over time, this creates resentment on both sides. He feels unappreciated and taken for granted, while his partner loses attraction to someone who seems to have no strong opinions or desires of his own. The transformation requires him to develop and express authentic preferences, to set boundaries around his time and energy, and to expect reciprocity in the relationship. This does not mean becoming selfish or demanding, but rather becoming a full participant in the partnership rather than a supporting character in someone else's story. He learns to express his desires clearly, to negotiate rather than simply capitulate when conflicts arise, and to be willing to walk away from relationships that cannot accommodate his legitimate needs and boundaries. The fear that often prevents this transformation is the belief that setting boundaries or refusing certain requests will result in rejection or abandonment. While this is sometimes true, Machiavelli would argue that relationships lost due to the establishment of healthy boundaries were never truly valuable to begin with. A person who can only tolerate you when you have no needs, opinions, or boundaries of your own is not someone who loves or respects you, they simply appreciate your convenience. The strong man, having destroyed his weak self, attracts different kinds of relationships. He draws people who appreciate strength and authenticity rather than those who seek someone easy to manipulate or control. His relationships become more genuine because they are based on mutual respect rather than one-sided accommodation. He discovers that people actually prefer to interact with someone who has clear positions and boundaries because it makes the relationship more predictable and trustworthy. This transformation extends beyond personal and professional relationships to encompass a man's entire approach to life. The weak man lives reactively, constantly adjusting his course based on others' expectations and opinions. He makes decisions based on what he thinks others want him to do rather than what aligns with his own values and goals. He pursues opportunities because they are safe or because others have told him they are good ideas, not because they genuinely excite him or advance his authentic aspirations. The strong man, conversely, becomes the author of his own story. He sets goals based on his own vision for his life rather than others' expectations. He takes calculated risks when the potential rewards align with his objectives, even if others counsel caution. He pursues paths that may be unconventional or challenging because they represent authentic expressions of his values and interests rather than safe choices designed to avoid criticism. This shift from reactive to proactive living is perhaps the most liberating aspect of destroying the weak self. When a man no longer needs constant approval or validation from others, he becomes free to make choices based on their actual merit rather than their social acceptability. He can pursue entrepreneurial ventures, creative projects, or lifestyle changes that others might view as risky or impractical because he is no longer enslaved to their opinions about his decisions. The process is not without its challenges. There will be relationships that cannot survive the transition from accommodation to authenticity. There will be professional situations where standing firm on principles comes with short-term costs. There will be social circles that become uncomfortable with his newfound willingness to express unpopular opinions or decline unreasonable requests. But these losses, while initially painful, ultimately serve to clear space in his life for better opportunities and relationships. The colleague who can only work with him when he accepts unfair treatment was never truly a valuable professional ally. The friend who distances themselves when he stops being available for one-sided support was never genuinely interested in mutual friendship. The romantic partner who loses interest when he begins expressing his own needs and desires was never truly attracted to him as a complete person. Machiavelli understood that real power, not the cheap imitation that comes from manipulation or dominance, flows naturally to those who have mastered themselves. The man who has conquered his need for approval, his fear of conflict, and his tendency to compromise his principles for temporary peace becomes someone others naturally look to for leadership and guidance. Not because he demands it, but because his strength and authenticity create a gravitational pull that draws others into his orbit. This is the deeper meaning behind Machiavelli's famous assertion that it is better to be feared than loved. He was not advocating for tyrannical behavior or cruelty. Rather, he was recognizing that respect based on strength is more reliable and, ultimately, more beneficial than affection based on accommodation. The fear he referenced is not terror, but the healthy apprehension that comes from dealing with someone who has clear boundaries and the strength to enforce them. The man who has destroyed his weak self inspires this kind of respect naturally. Others understand that he cannot be manipulated, that his word can be trusted, and that his friendship or partnership must be earned rather than assumed. This creates relationships built on mutual respect rather than convenience, professional interactions based on genuine value rather than exploitation, and a life trajectory guided by authentic purpose rather than external expectations. Part 2. The Architecture of Strength. The afternoon shadows grew longer as Machiavelli continued his work, his mind turning to the practical mechanisms by which a man transforms from weakness to strength. He had observed countless examples throughout his diplomatic career, men who had successfully reinvented themselves, shedding their people-pleasing tendencies to become forces of nature in their respective spheres. The transformation was never accidental, it always followed certain predictable patterns, certain strategic principles that could be learned and applied by any man willing to do the difficult work of self-reconstruction. The foundation of this transformation lies in understanding what Machiavelli called virtue, not virtue in the Christian sense of moral goodness, but rather the classical Roman concept of strength, excellence, and effectiveness. Virtue encompasses the ability to adapt to circumstances while maintaining core principles, to be both flexible in tactics and unwavering in strategic vision. It is the quality that allows a man to navigate complex social and professional environments without compromising his fundamental integrity. The development of virtue begins with the cultivation of strategic thinking. The weak man reacts to situations as they arise, often making decisions based on immediate emotional responses or the desire to avoid confrontation. The strong man, conversely, thinks several moves ahead, considering the long-term implications of his actions and the precedents he sets through his behavior. He understands that every interaction teaches others how to treat him in future encounters. Consider the seemingly simple act of responding to requests for favors or assistance. The weak man automatically says yes, believing that helpfulness will earn him goodwill and future reciprocation. He fails to recognize that consistently saying yes to unreasonable requests trains others to make increasingly unreasonable demands. The strong man evaluates each request strategically. Does this align with my goals? Does this person reciprocate when I need assistance? Will saying yes to this request enable me to better serve my authentic priorities, or will it simply drain my resources for someone else's convenience? This strategic approach extends to every aspect of life. In professional settings, the strong man carefully considers which projects to champion, which battles to fight, and which colleagues to invest time in cultivating relationships with. He recognizes that his energy and attention are finite resources that must be deployed strategically to maximize their impact on his goals rather than simply to maintain social harmony. The weak man often prides himself on being a team player, but his version of team play typically involves accepting unfair distributions of work, taking blame for others' mistakes, and allowing his contributions to be minimized or overlooked. He believes that his sacrifice will eventually be noticed and rewarded, failing to understand that organizations, like individuals, tend to take advantage of those who make themselves available for exploitation. The strong man redefines team play as holding himself and others to high standards, advocating for fair treatment and recognition, and refusing to enable dysfunction through his accommodation. He becomes known as someone who delivers excellent results but who also expects fair compensation, appropriate recognition, and respectful treatment in return. Rather than diminishing his value to the team, this approach typically increases it because colleagues and supervisors learn to appreciate the consistency and reliability of his standards. The cultivation of strategic thinking requires developing what Machiavelli termed the lion and the fox, the ability to be both strong and cunning as circumstances require. The lion represents direct strength, the willingness to confront problems head-on, to stand firm on principles even under pressure, and to accept conflict when it serves a greater purpose. The fox represents strategic intelligence, the ability to navigate complex social dynamics, to understand others' motivations, and to achieve objectives through careful planning rather than brute force. Most weak men possess neither quality effectively. They avoid direct confrontation even when it would serve their interests, but they also lack the strategic sophistication to achieve their goals through indirect means. They hope that their good intentions and hard work will be sufficient, failing to recognize that success in competitive environments requires both strength and strategy. The development of lion-like qualities begins with learning to identify and articulate boundaries clearly. The strong man knows what he will and will not accept, and he communicates these boundaries clearly and consistently. He does not apologize for having standards or make exceptions that undermine his credibility. When someone crosses a boundary, he addresses it directly and immediately, preventing small violations from escalating into larger patterns of disrespect. This directness often feels uncomfortable for men who have spent years avoiding confrontation. They worry that being direct will damage relationships or create unnecessary conflict. What they fail to understand is that unclear communication and inconsistent boundaries create far more relationship problems than honest, direct communication ever could. When expectations are unclear, disappointment and resentment are inevitable. When boundaries are inconsistent, others never know what to expect, creating anxiety and confusion that ultimately damage the relationship more than clear, consistent standards would. The development of fox-like qualities involves learning to read people and situations accurately, understanding the underlying motivations and dynamics at play in various interactions. The weak man often takes things at face value, assuming that others operate from the same motivations he does. He believes that if he treats others with kindness and respect, they will naturally reciprocate. The strong man recognizes that while this is sometimes true, it is far from universal, and that understanding others' actual motivations is crucial for navigating relationships effectively. This does not mean becoming cynical or manipulative. Rather, it means becoming realistic about human nature and strategic about how to achieve mutually beneficial outcomes. The strong man seeks to understand what others truly want and need, not just what they claim to want, so that he can find ways to align their interests with his own rather than simply hoping that his good intentions will be enough. For example, when dealing with a colleague who consistently takes credit for collaborative work, the weak man might simply hope that the truth will eventually come out or that the colleague will develop more integrity over time. The strong man recognizes that this behavior is likely to continue unless there are consequences, so he takes proactive steps to ensure his contributions are visible to relevant decision-makers. He might send summary emails documenting his contributions, speak up during meetings when credit is being assigned, or arrange for individual meetings with supervisors to discuss his role in successful projects. These actions are not manipulative or underhanded, they are simply strategic responses to the reality of the situation. The strong man understands that protecting his reputation and ensuring fair recognition for his contributions is his responsibility, not something he can delegate to others' sense of fairness or integrity. The fox-like approach also involves understanding the unspoken rules and power dynamics in various environments. Every organization, social group, and relationship has both explicit rules and implicit norms. The weak man focuses only on the explicit rules, assuming that following them will be sufficient for success. The strong man pays attention to both, recognizing that understanding and navigating the implicit norms is often more important than simply following the stated policies. In a corporate environment, for instance, the explicit rules might state that promotions are based on performance and qualifications. The implicit norms might reveal that promotions actually depend heavily on visibility to senior management, internal advocacy, and alignment with particular strategic initiatives. The weak man focuses on performing well and assumes that his results will speak for themselves. The strong man performs well but also ensures that his results are visible to decision-makers, cultivates relationships with influential colleagues, and aligns his contributions with the organization's strategic priorities. This strategic approach requires patience and long-term thinking. The weak man often expects immediate results from his efforts and becomes discouraged when his niceness and hard work are not quickly rewarded. The strong man understands that building a reputation for strength and reliability takes time, but that the investment pays compound dividends over the long term. The process of destroying the weak self also involves developing emotional independence, the ability to maintain equanimity and clear thinking regardless of others' opinions, moods, or reactions. The weak man is emotionally reactive, allowing his internal state to be determined by external circumstances. If others are pleased with him, he feels good about himself. If others are critical or disappointed, he feels anxious and inadequate. This emotional dependence makes him easily manipulated and prevents him from making decisions based on clear thinking rather than emotional reactions. The strong man develops what Machiavelli would recognize as emotional sovereignty. He maintains a stable sense of self-worth that is not dependent on others' approval or disapproval. He can remain calm and strategic even when others are upset or critical. He makes decisions based on his principles and strategic analysis rather than on emotional reactions to others' responses. This emotional independence is crucial for maintaining boundaries and enforcing consequences when necessary. The weak man often fails to follow through on boundaries because he cannot tolerate others' disappointment or anger. He would rather compromise his principles than deal with the temporary discomfort of others' negative reactions. The strong man recognizes that temporary discomfort is a small price to pay for long-term respect and effective relationships. Developing emotional independence requires practicing what Stoic philosophers called the discipline of desire, learning to want what happens rather than hoping that what you want will happen. This does not mean becoming passive or fatalistic, but rather focusing your energy on what you can control rather than trying to control things that are ultimately beyond your influence. You can control your actions, your principles, your effort, and your responses to circumstances. You cannot control others' reactions, the outcomes of your efforts, or the circumstances you encounter. The weak man exhausts himself trying to control others' opinions and reactions. The strong man focuses his energy on controlling his own actions and responses, accepting that others will react as they choose regardless of his preferences. This shift in focus creates tremendous psychological freedom. When you stop trying to control others' reactions, you can make decisions based on what is actually best rather than what you think will generate the most positive responses. When you stop seeking others' approval as your primary source of validation, you can pursue goals and projects that align with your authentic values rather than those that seem most likely to impress others. The strong man also develops what might be called strategic patience, the ability to endure short-term discomfort or disadvantage in service of long-term objectives. The weak man often sacrifices long-term interests for short-term comfort, saying yes to things he should decline simply to avoid the immediate discomfort of disappointing others. He compromises his principles to avoid conflict, not recognizing that this creates larger conflicts down the road when others discover they cannot rely on his consistency. The strong man understands that temporary discomfort is often the price of long-term success and satisfaction. He is willing to have difficult conversations now rather than allowing problems to fester. He is willing to disappoint people who have unreasonable expectations rather than compromising his ability to serve those who treat him fairly. He is willing to be misunderstood in the short term if it serves his authentic long-term interests. This strategic patience extends to career development, relationship building, and personal growth. The weak man often expects immediate results and becomes discouraged when change does not happen quickly. He may revert to old patterns of behavior when the new approaches do not immediately yield positive results. The strong man understands that meaningful change takes time and that setbacks are part of the process rather than evidence of failure. The cultivation of strategic patience requires developing a clear vision of long-term objectives. The weak man often lacks clear goals beyond wanting others to like and approve of him. This makes it difficult to evaluate whether short-term sacrifices are worthwhile because there is no clear long-term benefit they serve. The strong man develops specific, meaningful goals that provide a framework for decision-making and a motivation for enduring temporary discomfort. These goals should be authentic expressions of his values and interests rather than what he thinks others expect him to want. They should be challenging enough to require growth and strategic thinking but realistic enough to be achievable through sustained effort. They should serve as a North Star that guides decision-making and provides motivation during difficult periods of transition. The process of setting and pursuing authentic goals often reveals how much energy the weak man has been wasting on activities and relationships that do not serve his genuine interests. He begins to see how much time he has spent on projects he does not care about, in relationships that drain rather than energize him, and pursuing objectives that were never truly his own. This revelation can be both liberating and overwhelming. Liberating because it reveals tremendous untapped potential, overwhelming because it requires acknowledging how much time and energy has been misdirected. The strong man uses this revelation as fuel for transformation rather than cause for regret. He recognizes that the past cannot be changed, but that the future can be shaped through better decisions and clearer priorities. He begins to say no to activities and relationships that do not align with his authentic goals, freeing up resources to invest in opportunities that genuinely excite him and advance his real interests. This transition often involves a period of social disruption as others adjust to his changed behavior. Some people will be supportive of his growth and development. Others will resist the changes because they preferred the previous dynamic where his needs and interests were secondary to their convenience. The strong man accepts this disruption as a natural part of the process, understanding that authentic relationships will survive and strengthen while artificial ones will fade away. Part 3: The invincible man is the Tuscan sun set behind the rolling hills, casting long shadows across his study. Machiavelli penned the final insights that would complete his understanding of true strength. He had witnessed the rise and fall of princes, the transformation of weak men into leaders, and the inevitable destruction of those who refused to abandon their illusions about human nature. The conclusion he reached was both simple and profound. The man who successfully destroys his weak self does not merely become stronger, he becomes fundamentally invulnerable to the machinations and manipulations that destroy other men. This invulnerability does not come from building walls or becoming emotionally distant. Rather, it emerges from a deep understanding of what truly matters and an unshakable commitment to principles that cannot be compromised regardless of external pressure. The invincible man has learned to distinguish between what is essential and what is merely preferred, between what he can control and what he must accept, between what serves his authentic purpose and what merely feeds his ego. The journey to invincibility begins with the recognition that most of what we fear losing was never truly ours to begin with. The weak man lives in constant anxiety about losing others' approval, missing opportunities, or being excluded from social or professional circles. He shapes his behavior around these fears, compromising his authenticity to maintain his position in systems that may not actually serve his interests. The strong man recognizes that anything that can be lost through authentic behavior was never genuinely secure anyway. Consider the professional who fears that standing up for himself will result in termination or career setbacks. While this fear is not entirely irrational, there are indeed workplaces where integrity is punished rather than rewarded. It often reveals an attachment to a situation that is fundamentally unsustainable. If your livelihood depends on accepting disrespectful treatment, compromising your principles, or consistently sacrificing your well-being for others' convenience, then you are not in a position of strength regardless of your title or salary. The invincible man approaches such situations strategically. Rather than simply accepting poor treatment out of fear, he begins building alternatives while setting boundaries in his current situation. He develops his skills, expands his network, and creates options for himself so that he is not dependent on any single opportunity or relationship for his security and success. This process of creating alternatives is what truly provides security, not the illusion of safety that comes from constant accommodation. This principle applies equally to personal relationships. The man who fears that expressing his needs or setting boundaries will result in rejection often discovers that he is clinging to relationships that provide little genuine value or satisfaction. A relationship that cannot survive honest communication about needs and expectations is not a relationship worth preserving in its current form. Either it can evolve to accommodate both parties' authentic selves, or it should end to make space for connections that can support genuine intimacy and mutual respect. The invincible man does not fear these endings because he understands that authentic relationships are abundant for those who show up authentically. When you stop trying to be everything to everyone, you become something specific and valuable to the right people. When you stop accepting poor treatment to maintain connections, you free up energy and emotional space for relationships that actually nourish and support you. This transformation in approach to relationships often reveals how much energy the weak man has been spending on managing others' emotions and reactions. He has become skilled at reading moods, anticipating needs, and adjusting his behavior to maintain harmony, but this skill has come at the cost of developing his own emotional intelligence and self-awareness. He knows how to make others comfortable but has lost touch with his own needs and desires. The strong man redirects this energy inward, developing deep self-awareness and emotional regulation. He becomes skilled at understanding his own motivations, recognizing his emotional patterns, and making decisions from a place of clarity rather than reactivity. This internal focus does not make him selfish or insensitive to others, rather, it makes him more genuinely helpful because his assistance comes from a place of choice and abundance rather than compulsion and depletion. When the strong man chooses to help others, support causes, or make sacrifices, he does so from a position of strength and genuine desire to contribute rather than from fear of disapproval or compulsive people-pleasing. This makes his contributions more valuable because they are freely given rather than extracted through manipulation or social pressure. It also makes them more sustainable because they align with his authentic values rather than conflicting with his genuine interests. The invincible man has also learned to derive his sense of identity and worth from his principles and actions rather than from others' opinions or external validation. The weak man's self-esteem fluctuates based on how others treat him, what opportunities he receives, and how successful he appears compared to his peers. This external focus makes him vulnerable to manipulation and creates a constant state of anxiety as he tries to manage variables that are largely beyond his control. The strong man grounds his identity in his character, his efforts, and his commitment to his values. He measures his worth by whether he has acted with integrity, whether he has given his best effort to meaningful pursuits, and whether he has remained true to his principles under pressure. These are factors that remain within his control regardless of external circumstances, creating a stable foundation for self-respect that cannot be shaken by others' actions or opinions. This internal locus of evaluation creates what Machiavelli would recognize as true freedom. The man who does not need others' approval to feel good about himself cannot be controlled through the withdrawal or granting of that approval. The man who measures his success by his own standards rather than external recognition cannot be manipulated through promises of advancement or threats of exclusion. The man who derives satisfaction from living according to his principles rather than achieving specific outcomes cannot be broken by temporary setbacks or failures. This freedom manifests in countless practical ways throughout daily life. In negotiations, the invincible man can walk away from deals that do not serve his interests because he is not desperate for any particular outcome. In relationships, he can address problems directly because he is not terrified of conflict or rejection. In professional settings, he can advocate for himself and others because he is not paralyzed by the fear of being seen as difficult or demanding. The invincible man has also developed what might be called strategic detachment, the ability to care deeply about outcomes while not being emotionally dependent on achieving them. This might seem contradictory, but it is actually the key to peak performance in any domain. When you are desperate for a particular outcome, you tend to make decisions based on anxiety and desperation rather than clear thinking and strategic analysis. When you care about outcomes but are not attached to them, you can pursue them with full effort while maintaining the flexibility to adapt when circumstances change. This detachment is not indifference or apathy. The invincible man cares deeply about his work, his relationships, and his contribution to the world. But he has learned to distinguish between caring about something and being emotionally dependent on controlling its outcome. He gives his best effort to his work without being devastated if it is not recognized or rewarded as he hopes. He invests in relationships without being destroyed if they do not develop as he wishes. He pursues goals with passion while accepting that some attempts will fail and that failure is information rather than evidence of personal inadequacy. This strategic detachment is particularly important in competitive environments where others may try to undermine his efforts or manipulate his emotions to gain advantage. The weak man can be thrown off his game by criticism, sabotage, or unexpected setbacks because his emotional stability depends on things proceeding according to plan. The invincible man maintains his equilibrium regardless of external circumstances because his peace of mind comes from his commitment to his process rather than his attachment to specific results. The development of strategic detachment requires what Machiavelli would call philosophical training, the cultivation of wisdom about the nature of life, success, and human relationships. The weak man often operates from naive assumptions about fairness, meritocracy, and human nature. He believes that good intentions should be enough, that hard work will automatically be rewarded, and that treating others well guarantees reciprocal treatment. These beliefs, while admirable in their optimism, leave him unprepared for the realities of competitive environments and complex human dynamics. The invincible man develops a more sophisticated understanding of how the world actually operates. He recognizes that life is not always fair, that good intentions without strategic thinking often fail to achieve their objectives, and that some people will take advantage of kindness rather than reciprocating it. This recognition does not make him cynical or cruel, rather, it makes him strategic and realistic about how to achieve positive outcomes in an imperfect world. This philosophical sophistication enables him to respond to challenges and setbacks with wisdom rather than emotional reactivity. When faced with unfair treatment, he does not waste energy on indignation or self-pity but instead focuses on strategic responses that protect his interests and advance his objectives. When dealing with difficult people, he does not expect them to suddenly become reasonable but instead develops strategies for managing the interaction that serve his purposes while maintaining his integrity. The invincible man has also learned to view challenges and obstacles as opportunities for growth and demonstration of strength rather than as problems to be avoided. The weak man tries to minimize risk and avoid situations where he might fail or face criticism. This risk-averse approach keeps him in familiar but limiting circumstances, preventing the growth that comes from facing and overcoming challenges. The strong man seeks out challenges that align with his goals and values, understanding that each obstacle overcome makes him stronger and more capable. He does not court unnecessary difficulty, but he does not shy away from pursuing important objectives simply because they involve risk or uncertainty. He has learned that the attempt to avoid all risk actually creates the greatest risk of all, the risk of a life unlived, of potential unrealized, of authentic self unexpressed. This willingness to face challenges creates a positive feedback loop that builds genuine confidence over time. Each challenge faced and obstacle overcome provides evidence of his capability and resilience. This evidence-based confidence is far more stable than the artificial confidence that comes from avoiding difficulty or having one's ego artificially inflated by others' praise. The invincible man's confidence is quiet and unshakable because it is based on demonstrated capability rather than mere hope or others' opinions. He knows he can handle challenges because he has handled them before. He knows he can recover from setbacks because he has recovered from them before. He knows he can maintain his principles under pressure because he has done so before. This track record creates an inner certainty that others can sense and respect. This genuine confidence manifests differently from the false bravado often displayed by insecure individuals. The invincible man does not need to prove his strength through aggression, domination, or the diminishment of others. His strength is evident in his calm presence, his clear communication, and his consistent actions. Others recognize his power not because he demands recognition but because his competence and integrity speak for themselves. The final characteristic of the invincible man is his ability to create value for others while maintaining his own boundaries and principles. The weak man often believes he must choose between serving others and serving himself, leading to either self-sacrificing martyrdom or selfish disregard for others' needs. The invincible man recognizes that the most sustainable and satisfying approach involves finding ways to serve others that also align with his own values and objectives. This approach creates what game theorists call positive sum outcomes situations where everyone involved benefits rather than one party gaining at another's expense. The invincible man becomes skilled at identifying these opportunities and structuring relationships and projects in ways that serve multiple parties' interests simultaneously. This makes him valuable to others not because he sacrifices himself for their benefit, but because his success tends to create success for those around him. This ability to create mutual benefit makes the invincible man naturally attractive to high-quality people and opportunities. Others want to work with him, support his projects, and include him in their endeavors because they know that his success will likely contribute to their own success as well. This creates an upward spiral where his strength and integrity attract better opportunities, which in turn allow him to develop greater strength and demonstrate greater integrity. The transformation from weakness to invincibility is not a destination but an ongoing process of growth and refinement. The invincible man does not believe he has achieved perfection but rather commits to continuous improvement in his character, capabilities, and wisdom. He views each day as an opportunity to practice his principles, refine his strategies, and contribute value to the world around him. This commitment to growth keeps him humble despite his strength, curious despite his knowledge, and open to feedback despite his confidence. He understands that true strength requires ongoing vigilance against the tendency toward complacency or arrogance that can undermine even the strongest foundation. He remains a student of life, human nature, and his own continuous development. As Machiavelli closed his manuscript that evening, he understood that he had captured something essential about the nature of human strength and dignity. The man who destroys his weak self does not become invulnerable through the elimination of all challenges or the guarantee of specific outcomes. Rather, he becomes invulnerable because he has developed the character, wisdom, and capabilities necessary to thrive regardless of circumstances. Such a man cannot be destroyed by others because he has already destroyed the parts of himself that were vulnerable to destruction: his desperate need for approval, his fear of authentic self-expression, his dependence on external validation for his sense of worth. What remains is essential and unshakable: his principles, his capabilities, his commitment to growth, and his capacity to create value in the world. This is the true meaning of Machiavellian strength, not the power to dominate others, but the power to remain authentic, strategic, and valuable regardless of external pressures or circumstances. It is the power that comes from self-mastery, the invincibility that emerges from destroying the weak self, and the respect that naturally flows to those who have learned to command it through strength of character rather than manipulation or accommodation. The weak man fears that shedding his people-pleasing tendencies will leave him isolated and unloved. The invincible man discovers that authentic strength attracts authentic relationships, meaningful opportunities, and genuine respect. He learns that the very qualities he feared would drive others away, his boundaries, his principles, his refusal to compromise his authentic self, are actually what make him most valuable and attractive to the people and opportunities that truly matter. In destroying his weak self, he does not become less human but more fully human. In refusing to accommodate unreasonable demands, he does not become selfish but more genuinely generous. In learning to command respect, he does not become dominating but more truly powerful. And, in this transformation, he discovers the profound truth that Machiavelli understood centuries ago: the man who masters himself becomes master of his destiny, and such mastery is the only true invincibility in an uncertain world.